You've probably heard one of these. Animal-based diets wreck your cholesterol, or eating a lot of animal protein is bad for your health. Well, let's test those headlines against reality. My labs. Total cholesterol is flagged, HDL is high, triglycerides are low, and the rest of the metabolic picture is stable and balanced. I'm going to take you through line by line and show you what actually matters. Quick context. My diet is heavily animal-based and anchored in the regeneratively raised grass-finished meats that we produce at Harvest Hills Ranch. Now, I still consume plant-based foods. However, protein is the first requirement that I always meet in my diet. And while today's video is not medical advice, it is a transparent walkthrough of my labs so you can learn how to look at your labs more completely and not fear an animal-based diet to build your health. The information that I'm going to be sharing with you today was generated as part of a life insurance exam that I recently underwent. When I get towards the end of the video, I'm going to share with you why that's important, because it really is going to allow us to see how important some of these numbers are and put them in context that is different than what you typically hear. So let's look at these labs. Let's get into these. You'll notice, and you can tell that this was part of a life insurance exam, because the first thing they wanted to know did I have any metabolites of cocaine in my system? Clearly that's negative, but that's a side point. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about today. And I want to begin by looking at the two markers that flagged high on this report for me, the first of which is going to be total cholesterol. You can see my total cholesterol is at a 220, and interestingly enough, that's the highest I've ever measured my cholesterol at. I've had it just over 200 before. I can even remember when it was in the low 100s. But the point here is that with it at a 220, that in many instances would flag concern. But here's what I'll ask you to consider when it comes to total cholesterol is that total cholesterol, as you see it in these reports, is a sum. It's the cumulative value for your LDL, your HDL, your VLDL. And the main point here is that when you look at total cholesterol alone, it by itself doesn't predict risk because it doesn't provide any context. And that's truly what we need to be able to look at next is what is the context that we're working in. So let's continue on to try to actually generate that and to see if that total cholesterol is a value that I need to be concerned about. You'll notice the next number that's elevated here is what's called the HDL. HDL is often termed the good cholesterol. I personally am not much of a fan of using the terminology of good and bad cholesterol because I don't think that it translates accurately into what cholesterol is doing in the body. I think that's more important to look at mechanistically how it's operating. But the point is that an 81, you'll see this is again what's termed the good cholesterol, but you'll notice on this that I actually went above what the ideal range here is. I went up to an 81 on this. That's a very strong, very robust number here. And when HDL is strong and the triglycerides are low, that generally is going to illustrate a much better landscape. You've got those two, the HDL and the triglycerides. When they're at a 1-to-1 or even better ratio, that's when you're typically going to see an overall more balanced metabolic picture. And as I'll show you in just a moment with my triglycerides, where they actually land at, that I'm definitely within that 1-to-1. I'm actually well below that 1-to-1 here. But remember, the reason we're talking about this is we're interested to know if an animal-based diet is truly having a negative impact on my overall health. Not just my cholesterol, my overall health. But as it continues in this cholesterol conversation, let's now go over and look at the LDL. You'll notice on this that the LDL is at a 126, and that is getting close to the upper limits here. It's interesting, I've seen some studies of recent where there's an argument to be made for LDL cholesterol to be pushed under 70. That, for wherever you fall on that, I think that personally is a bit extreme. And I think, again, to look at a single marker doesn't illustrate the point that you need context when you're interpreting any of these markers. These markers should all be looked at as a collective. You don't need to be looking at these in isolation. And if you're doing that, you're probably going to make an inaccurate judgment on what the next step needs to be as far as an intervention. But LDL, it's typically your low density lipoprotein. You may hear it referred that way, but it doesn't give you a particle number. Particle numbers are also important in this conversation. And you see some of this happening now where there's the acknowledgement of looking at apoB. That can be a bit more precise, certainly, than just looking at the LDL. Let's keep moving here, and you'll notice now we start to get into some ratios, and the total cholesterol to HDL ratio here is at a 2.7, and now you're going to see the real theme start to manifest in that you'll see that these ratios are well under what would be suggested as a risk range. So that total cholesterol to HDL is where it needs to be. The LDL to HDL ratios, I tell patients that even when I'm being very scrutinizing and trying to optimize their health, that I want to see these ratios at 2 to 1 or less. And so that is certainly under 2 at a 1.56. But notice by standard ranges here, you could be up over 5.3, illustrating that you're not going to get the true risk assessment that you might be looking for here. Now, this is really, that's a statement geared more towards looking at these labs in a very traditional static disease state mindset, as opposed to looking at them from a functional perspective, which I would generally recommend to do on this. It's going to be more insightful. But here's where I think you have to really look in more detail is what are the triglyceride levels? And this is going to start to move us into the conversation around blood sugar. We'll start to see some blood sugar numbers present as we go through this. But notice at a 62, that number is very solid. That tells me that there's not a lot of circulating triglycerides. There's not going to be, I've automatically, even with just what I'm looking at here, and this was my thought even the first time I saw this report, is that a 62 triglycerides is likely going to confirm for me that I don't have blood sugar concerns. Now, we'll look at other glucose-related markers to validate that, but that was my initial thought, at least with this. And certainly now when I think that I have a 220 cholesterol, that 220 cholesterol with a triglyceride at a 62, the risk associated with that is essentially nullified. There really is no risk linked to that, and that's even in light of having the HDL up at an 81. So when you take that cumulative picture, that is a balanced metabolic picture, independent of the fact that that total cholesterol is elevated. The total cholesterol by itself is not giving us pause. It's not giving concern, and especially now when we pull in and look at the rest of these numbers. As I continue on through here, I skipped a section here just to make mention on this. These are looking for diuretics or any type of beta adrenergic blockers that I may have been using. I don't use any medication, so there would have been no reason for those to pop positive. But what we're interested in are looking at some of these other markers here. So for example, the blood urea nitrogen. You can see on this, the blood urea nitrogen is creeping up towards the higher side here. I don't deem this to be a problem. Certainly by these ranges, even it's still within range. This is a byproduct of higher protein intake in the diet. That's essentially what you're looking at there. I actually feel more comfortable with it being up in this range. Most of the time when I'm working with patients, I'm trying to push them up above 15. Really like to see them more in the 18 to 20 range, assuming that they don't have any type of reason for me not to be pushing protein for them, which most of them certainly don't. Most individuals are going to benefit from a higher protein intake. We get down into the creatinine, and I will just interject as a side note here that I'm very consistent with my exercise and workout routines, and you'll notice that creatinine is a breakdown product of muscle tissue. So I feel like for me, as I'm looking at this is a validation that my activity level is certainly in line with what my dietary intake is, and that we've got a balance between those two. I'm getting sufficient amounts of activity to optimize metabolic activity. pH, my pH is where it should be as far as urine. There's a couple of other urine markers in here that I'll just really sort of move through fairly quickly on this. I did want to look at the total protein here. You'll notice total protein in urine is good. So what that's telling me is that there's nothing wrong with my kidneys, right? That's always one of the big concerns when it comes to the high animal-based protein intake, is that it's going to have some impact on your kidneys. Newsflash for you on that, guys. That line of thought has never really held water for individuals with normal kidney function. And even recent studies have shown now that when you even have some degree of kidney dysfunction, having higher protein still does not further damage the kidney function. So that line of thought, really, even from a literature standpoint and what research we have to be able to look at and investigate that really does not add up. We continue on through here. You can see just a lot of markers related to the urine. All these showed up negative. I wasn't excreting anything or urinating out anything that would have been problematic. We get down to the alkaline phosphatase here, and a couple of things that I thought about when I looked at the alkaline phosphatase. Clearly it's in range there. It's not high, and in addition to, well, here's where you might think about this. You might think about alkaline phosphatase as it relates to the bone, to the liver. Those are generally the two primary organs that we would be concerned about, or organ systems we would be concerned about. And then also the gut can release alkaline phosphatase enzymes also. So if we were to see this elevate, we may think that the gut could be a factor here. What I want you to take away from this, the gut and the liver are the two organ systems I want you to think about, because for those that would suggest that the higher animal-based protein intake is going to create dysfunction in the gut, well, this would suggest that that's not the case. Now, granted, if I really wanted to do a deep, thorough investigation on the gastrointestinal tract, what the dynamics of the gut are, then I'm going to do a stool test to be able to acquire that information. But just as a precursor, a cursory look at this, do we have concern around it? No, we don't. And we would even say, as it relates to liver function here, alkaline phosphatase doesn't seem to present any element of liver dysfunction either. Now, one thing that did stand out very interesting to me is that I always, anytime I see an alkaline phosphatase under 70, one thing I'm looking for is the possibility for a zinc deficiency. Now, I also like to correlate that with white spots on the fingernails. And when I look at my fingernails, I don't see any white spots on the fingernails. And so I would look at this and say, that makes sense to me, because an animal-based diet is going to be higher in zinc. That's going to be a mineral that is readily available through an animal-based diet, and especially if you think about the roles that zinc plays in terms of immune function, hormonal health, and there's just so many applications for zinc, this would seem to suggest, and when I'm correlating here, that I may run a little lower on my alkaline phosphatase as my normal level, and that I don't have any indications for a zinc deficiency. We continue on. We look a little deeper here. We've got the total bilirubin. Looks totally fine. I did mention the liver enzymes, and you'll notice with these liver enzymes, with the AST and the ALT, the ALT, oftentimes I look at that as the more liver specific of these two, and you'll notice that ALT is actually under the AST. Therefore, we would not take away from this that there is a concern related to liver function. Again, that higher amount of protein intake is not putting an increased stress on the liver. I think it's also worth noting in this, I probably should have said this earlier on, some of you may be asking, well, what's a high animal protein intake? I am usually shooting somewhere around about a gram per pound of body weight per day is what my ideal target is as far as that. And that's not just consuming beef. That's consuming beef, beef, chicken, turkey, duck, the duck eggs, chicken eggs, dairy, cheeses, actually the milk and the cheeses themselves, yogurt. So there's a lot of different sources for proteins that I'm bringing into my diet. The GGT, that's going to be more of the gallbladder. Definitely some association there with liver, nothing here. You'll see total protein levels look good as well. Albumin, right where it should be. Globulin, so breaking that total protein down. These all look very good and no concerns with any of these. Now, the one area in here that this is looking for tobacco. I'm not a tobacco user. The one area in here that I want to look at a little deeper with you is related to glucose. I think it's important to note that when it comes to glucose, this can be one of the fastest ways to disrupt metabolic stability. This can also be a scenario where if you do have an elevated cholesterol and you do have blood sugar dysfunction associated with it. And there's a lot of ways to say that: blood sugar dysfunction, hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you can talk about this and have this conversation. But if that is a factor and you are leaning towards metabolic instability, then a higher total cholesterol could be possibly of concern. So, right, it's the total picture you're looking at there. But again, that's simply not enough to just even then look at the total cholesterol. You still need to look at that HDL. You still need to look at the total LDL, triglycerides. All those come into play. But notice, just to the point here, and this is one of the things that I personally appreciate that is a attribute to an animal-based diet, is that it is a very metabolically stabilizing diet. You can see my blood glucose here is at a 91. I had been fasting for about 11 and a half hours by the time I took this test. I would imagine, and you'll see why somewhat of what I'm getting ready to say doesn't matter too much here, but I would imagine that my fasting blood glucose would probably be in the mid to upper 80s had my blood been taken somewhere around probably the 10-hour mark, as opposed to having gone longer than that. So I just told you 11 hours. That's not accurate. I finished eating at 8 o'clock the night before, and I had my test taken at 10:30 the next morning. So it was actually 14 and a half hours is how long I had fasted when I took this test. So if I had fasted for, say, 10 to 12 hours, I'd probably be down in the 80s here. I think what ended up happening is that I probably got a little surge of cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, just to keep my blood glucose stable is probably what I'm looking at there. But here's why it doesn't really matter that much. When you look at the urine glucose, clearly that is negative, but now you're looking at my hemoglobin A1C, a longer-term marker for glycemic management, for glucose management. Anywhere between, and again, this is where I look at from a functional standpoint, just to really dial these numbers in. Anywhere from a 5.2 to a 5.5 is where I personally want to be sitting at. You'll notice that this is at a 5.4. That shows metabolic stability without question. And just for those of you that are interested in some of these other numbers here, I do want to point out the BMI. You can see my BMI is over 25. Technically, that puts me in the overweight range on this. I'm definitely not overweight, and I clearly, as I've illustrated here for you, don't have metabolic instability. So this is one of those scenarios, and I was very thankful for this when they took this, and this is going to lead back into the insurance part for a minute. And one of the things that they did is they measured my chest circumference, and then they measured my waist circumference. And that was important, and I was really excited to see that they did that, because what that illustrated to them is that 25.9 BMI was that putting me in that overweight category was a byproduct of adequate muscle tissue development. And the actuaries for the insurance company, and if you're not familiar with that term, these are the guys that look at the data. They're reading the data at the highest level that you can possibly do, and they have this so dialed in when making decisions for the insurance company, because they have seen so much data and see what the true trends and risk are based on data like I've shown you here today. one additional point on this, just so I want you to see it, is that I'm 5'9", 176 pounds, and you'll notice that when they took my blood pressure readings, they were pretty consistent. They were all hovering somewhere around about 110/70. Now, back to the insurance part here for a minute. The reason that is an important aspect to this is that when I actually was speaking with my agent on this, one of the things that as we were talking, they told me is that the insurance company actually gave me preferred status on my policy. So that's the highest status that you can be put into. And the reason, again, that is important is they were only able to slot me into that preferred status because they looked and they know that this data is not problematic. They understand that a total cholesterol at 220, especially matched up with an HDL of an 81 and triglycerides at a 62 for an individual that doesn't show any other metabolic dysfunction throughout the entirety of the assessment, as well as having adequate muscle tissue development and anthropometric or body measurements. These guys understand that it doesn't matter if you fall outside of that 200 upper limit when it comes to total cholesterol, because the true risk just isn't there. And that certainly matches up to my diet. It matches up to my lifestyle. It matches up to how I actually feel every day. I feel very energetic and I feel like I have a lot of vitality every day. And I wanted each of you that if any of you have really been gun shy about jumping into an animal-based diet, I wanted you to see firsthand. It's one thing to just say something, but it's another thing to be able to take those same statements and match it up with real-world data and see what that data actually says. Now, I do have one quick note for you here. If this is a sidebar, but if you guys are in Texas or Louisiana, you need to know that Harvest Hills Ranch ships beef direct to your door. It's 100% grass-fed and grass-finished. It's regeneratively raised for nutrient density. And if you're looking for bundles, halves, quarters, we've got you covered. Now, with that said, let's wrap this conversation up. If today helped you see past a single marker, past a single cholesterol number, then the next piece that I'm going to share with you is really going to complete this puzzle. Labels drive a lot of the fear and confusion, as well as other influencers out there saying things but not being able to match it up with data like I've shared with you today. And so I want to take the next step with you, and I want to break down these grass-fed label lies and see why these may actually be a stumbling block for you. We'll separate some of the marketing from what actual meaning is here, so you can shop with confidence and focus on nutrient density, grass finished foods, pasture raised foods, depending on what animal we're talking about. And these are going to be the foods that are going to actually support your health. So go ahead and tap that video on the screen to watch Grass Fed Label Lies next.